Okay, sorry again for the delay. Just about ready to start. So we're talking about the laws of, of course, we're in the laws of neighbors. And last 2 weeks, we discussed the law of, in the case where we build a wall between the two neighbors because one party decides that they want a wall. That was the big idea here, that even one neighbor or what we call one partner could unilaterally decide to separate and build a wall. So the discussion was, how tall should the wall be? So the idea was that there's a minimum height that both have to pay for, and that is 4 cubits, which would be approximately the height of a person that would give it privacy. And the idea was that each party could compel the other one to participate in that cost, because privacy is, I don't want to say the right because it's not phrased as a right. Each person has a responsibility not to damage their fellow by viewing their space, thus constricting their fellow's ability to use that space. And then we had a discussion of what happens if one party wants to build 4 cubits and one party wants to build 10 cubits. So I only build 4. I don't want to participate for the 10. But if then I show that I want to use the 10, then I have to chip in for that. Okay. And that we debated that last 2 weeks. Now we get to a law that's a little bit different. The law actually is unusual, and I'm going to show you how it's unusual. But the law says as follows. What happens if I have a house, and my house, it's he calls it a churba, so it's not completely built. In other words, not all the walls are protected. It's not fully functioning house. So I don't have a wall around it because I don't really live there, or I don't live there full time. We'll just see what the commentaries say. But in any case, I happen to have a neighbor, and my neighbor surrounds me. In other words, my neighbor's property surrounds my property all 4 directions. Now, so the first case is I'm in the middle, and my friend is rebuilding his land or building his land. So my friend surrounds all of his properties with fences, or 3 of his properties with fences. Turns out I now got my wall fenced. I got 3 walls around my property for free because my friend decided to build a wall, and we don't really live there full time, so he can't force me to pay for it. But he did upgrade my property because my fence now was redone. Now I have a beautiful fence. It's not mine, it's my neighbor's, but my neighbor surrounded me from 3 directions. We had our neighbor, and they came. God forbid, there was an old fence. Looked fine to me, but it was an old fence. So they tore down the fence and built an exactly replica, the exact same fence, same height, same wood. Everything was the same, but it was new. Okay, so I got myself a new fence. Would I pay for it? Of course not. What do I need the fence for, right? But the bottom line is, did I benefit? Maybe. Okay, fine. So Maimonides says, you fenced me in from 3 directions, even though you made it more beautiful. You can't bill me for the cost of 50% of the cost of building the wall. Because I could always claim, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I did not get any benefits, because 3 walls are nice, but what does it help me to have a property that's fenced in from 3 directions if anybody can enter from the 4th? So I say, you didn't help me, you didn't benefit me. So if you didn't benefit me, you can't bill me. In other words, what's happening here is like this. It's not talking about a case where I'm living there full time, and then I have to participate in the wall because I'm looking into your property and I'm damaging you. So then you can force me to participate in the building of the wall. It's interesting that the Talmud talks about in the case of fields, but we're going to stick with Maimonides' example for a moment. So Maimonides is saying, I'm not living there, but you're upgrading your property. And when you upgrade your property, by definition, I'm going to get some benefit. So now the question becomes, when and how do I have to pay? You see how that's similar to last week's discussion, where I say, I don't want you to build your wall more than 4. You build it up to 10, so I don't have to pay more than 4. But sometimes if I show that I'm going to benefit from it and I want to get benefit, sometimes I would have to pay more. So a similar thing is happening here, even though what's happening here is much more extreme. And like I said, as we're going to see, it's unusual. It's not the classic case. And the commentators want to try to express and discuss what's the difference between this case and the classic case. In other words, this is an exception. Okay, now comes the trouble. So far, I don't think what I said would offend anybody. But here is the problem. The problem becomes, and it's a problem because it's against our what we understand to be proper, our sense of justice. But also, it's a problem because doesn't seem consistent with the conventional general rule of the Talmud, as I will explain. But first, let me give you the case. The case is, I go and I build, what happens if my neighbor didn't build 3 walls around my house? He built 4 walls around my property because he happens to have 4 homes around my home, and he fenced in each one. So now I'm completely fenced in. Now my land is protected. Now I don't have to hire a security company. Now I benefit. So Maimonides, it's a big debate in the Talmud. Maimonides quotes the opinion and says, look, if you build four walls, you have to pay. They can bill me for 50% of all the walls. Give me just 1 second. I want to make sure I'm not.
Rabbi, is there a difference between upgrading the fence and building brand new? Probably.
Yes. Give me just 1 second. Okay, some interesting laws here. Upgrading. If you're upgrading a law, you can't bill me. Upgrading a wall, you can't bill me. Why? Because I say you didn't help me. What did you help me? You got a nicer wall? I don't need a nicer wall. But somehow the Talmud seems to see, you'll see in a minute that it's not so simple why the Talmud says this, but somehow the argument is that in this case is the exception to the rule, because this case, there's some objective measure of benefit. You had an open property, what they call a churba, a broken down shack. It's parutz, it's open. People, animals take refuge. I told you about this house behind my house. The windows were open till about 2 weeks ago or a month ago. Been living here for 8 years. I have no idea what lives there. There are animals at night. There's conversations. There's discussions. There are parties of animals. Nobody knows what's going on there, right? I'm afraid to walk in there during the daytime because of what's going on. Now, thank God, they close all the windows and the doors and they change the paneling. Now it looks like a mansion. Okay, the inside is still, they're renovating. But the point here is when something is closed, there's an objective measure of benefit. So the first case of the Talmud, the first case that Maimonides offers, and we'll read it inside in a moment, is if you surround me from 3 walls, you fix up, in that metaphor, you fix up all the windows on 3 sides. I could say, I'm not paying for it. The animals can still get in. The people can still get in. So you didn't really give me a benefit. But if you surround me from 4 sides, now you can make me pay. Now, how much to pay, what quality of the wall, all this is discussed and all this is dissected. But I just want to read maybe the section of Maimonides inside. We'll share the screen and then we can analyze further. Unless anybody wants to comment first, because it's a free country. We let people speak up whenever they want. Okay, so what we're sharing here is Maimonides, the Laws of Neighbors, chapter 3, section 3, which is where we're up to. Last week we read section 1 and 2, or last 2 weeks we read section 1 and 2. The following rules apply when a person owns one ruin in the midst of several ruins. A ruin is a house, but it's not functioning. It's not fully functioning. Nobody's living there. And like I said, if I'm living there, there's no discussion. If I'm living there, that we'd already established that the neighbor can force the other neighbor to participate in the building of the wall for the sake of privacy. But because nobody's living here at the time, you can't really bill me. I'm not living in my property, so I'm not damaging your property by sight. But in any case, I have one ruin amidst several ruins belonging to my friend, to my colleague. Although the colleague builds a divider on the side of the owner's ruin, and then on a second side, and then on the third side, and thus the ruin is enclosed from three sides. So now my neighbor comes to me and says, look, I upgraded your property. Now you have three walls built. Now, if you ever decide to rebuild your home, all you'll have to do is build a fourth wall and your property is protected. So I benefited you 3/4 of the value of the security, what you would have to pay for security. So Maimonides says, no, we do not obligate the owner to pay any of the costs, for the construction is of no benefit to him, since the ruin is still open to the public domain as it was before. So what does it help me that you made three walls if you left one side open? So that's still okay. Now we get to the problematic part. However, therefore, if the builder also encloses the fourth side for him, my neighbor makes four fences in his property, and he fences all three sides for the benefit of his own property. And then he fences in the fourth for the benefit of my neighbor's property. But as a result, now I have a fenced in protected property. The value of that property goes up. And thus the owner's ruin is totally enclosed by a partition. We require him to pay his share in the entire amount. Entire amount means all four walls. He must pay half the cost that his colleague undertook in building the divider 4 cubits high around and all four sides. Again, Maimonides is clear, just 4 cubits, not higher than 4 cubits. This applies provided the place of the wall belongs to both of them. So what does that mean? In the case that I told you before that my neighbor changed their fence, I wouldn't have to pay even if they fenced me in completely, because up until now, when we discussed the case that both, I don't think we read it inside yet. We may have skipped it, but up until now, when we discussed the cases of the neighbors forcing each other to build a wall, where do you build the wall? You build the wall on the border between both properties. But because they were talking about a stone wall in those days, so the stone wall takes up a certain breadth, and that breadth was half on your property and half on mine. So in other words, the space upon which the wall was built was on both pieces of land. Therefore, both parties were allowed to use the wall. If I want to use the wall as a supporting beam, if I want to hang up things on that wall, whatever it may be, I could hang up things, and I can even make a hole in that wall to support a beam, because the wall belongs to both of us, because it's on both of our properties. Okay. Now, Maimonides says, one second. If this guy came and built the wall only on my neighbor, all 4 walls, only on my neighbor's property, then I don't have to chip in anything, even if they surrounded, even if they benefited me. Why? Because since my neighbor chose to build the wall on my neighbor's property, therefore, I am not allowed to use that wall for my benefit. I can't use it to support my beams, for example. I can't use it to hang things up. It's not my wall. And therefore, because I'm not allowed to use the wall, I don't have to pay for it. But if my neighbor, it's actually interesting, if my neighbor doesn't build it exclusively on his land, but he puts it on both our lands, which he's allowed to do, even though he's trespassing, but no, that area between the lands is reserved for the wall, because each party can compel the other party to build a wall. So basically what we're saying is we're minimizing this law and saying it only, Maimonides is doing this, it only applies when I build a wall for you that you can actually use, as opposed to when I build a wall on my own property that the neighbor cannot use. So this brings to mind that in the wall and fence that I'm talking about, when my neighbor moved in, took down the fence, I put up a new fence. So on our side of the wall, it was the neighbor's wall and the neighbor's property. But on our side of the wall, from the previous owners, both previous owners, because we moved in before our neighbors moved in, there was, what do they call that? There was the dial that tells the thermostat that tells the temperature outside. They came, they changed their wall, they took down the thermostat, built a new wall, and put it back up. And I'm thinking now that was very nice of them. They didn't have to. If the wall's on their property, they could say, well, we don't want we don't want you hanging your junk on our property. And we like it because it's right outside the kitchen window. We get to see the weather. So the point is, but it's interesting. I'm just thinking about it right now. It's interesting. It's in their property. I really shouldn't be allowed to put up a wall. By now I could, as you will see, because enough time passed. So by now I could say, no, I have the right to put my clock on that dial on that wall because it's been like this for so many years. Okay, but that's the big picture. That's the big idea. Maybe we'll read one more, and that will give us a little bit more of a idea of where and how this applies, and then we'll ask this. We'll try to address the essential question, which may be bothering some people, but it bothers us from a Talmudic perspective, which is, how could you bill me for a benefit that I am getting if I didn't necessarily acknowledge explicitly that I want that benefit? That's really what's at the heart of what's happening here. So we'll read one more section, the next section, and then we'll try to address this. So I'm going back to Maimonides, going back to the next section. If, however, the builder constructs the wall on his own property, right? What's happening is same case. I have my churba, my ruin, my home that's not built in middle, and you surround me on all sides, and you build walls all around your property, but you build it on your property. And now by extension, as a result of your actions, now my land is completely walled in. So, but since you build the wall on your property, it appears to me, says Maimonides. In other words, Maimonides, when he says appears to me, it means this is not written in the Talmud, but this is his own view. It appears to me that the owner is charged only a small amount as the judges see fit because he does not have the right to use the walls. So what Maimonides is trying to do is he's trying to limit the application of this law. The application of this law is interesting. In other words, it's you can come without my consent, you can build walls on our border, and then ultimately, if you build 4 walls, you can bill me 50% of the cost. So Maimonides is a little bit uncomfortable with this, so he's trying to minimize the application. So he says, you know what? That works. You can't disagree with the Talmud. So that works if they build a wall in a land that both of us share, so both of us could benefit from the wall. But Maimonides says, if my neighbor builds the wall on my neighbor's property, so in other words, I'm not allowed to use that wall, so then Maimonides lowers my liability. Yeah, I have to chip in a small percentage, but not 50% of the value of the wall. And now there's one more case that's actually interesting. The second half of 4 is interesting. Going back to the case where you build 3 walls around my property. What was the law if you built 3 walls around my property? The law is that I don't have to chip in. Why don't I have to chip in? Because I didn't get any benefit. Now, this is similar to what we said last week. Says Maimonides, if I go and build a 4th wall, you build 3 walls, and I didn't ask for it, and you can't bill me because I didn't agree. But if I go myself and build a 4th wall, close off my property, then you come and you can bill me 50% for the 3 walls that my neighbor built. Because my neighbor says, look, you see now by you building your 4th wall and closing your ruin, that proves that you want the ruin to be enclosed. You want the ruin to be enclosed, so we're going to bill you 50% for the first 3 walls that you built. If this makes sense. So let's read it inside, and then we'll see if anybody has any comments or questions. So now the second half of 4. If the person whose property was enclosed himself encloses the 4th side, in other words, my neighbor built 3 walls around my property to enclose his 3 properties. I then show up. What's the law right then? Right then, my neighbor can't bill me anything, 0, even though he built 3 walls around me. But I could say, look, I did not receive any benefit. But if I then go and build the 4th wall, says Maimonides, he has revealed his consent, even though it's retroactive. But I revealed my consent, and he must pay half the cost of the other 3 sides, if the wall belongs to both of them, right? In other words, if it was built on the land belonging to both of them. Similar principles apply in all analogous situations. Okay, that's 3 and 4. If you don't want to ask the question, I'll ask the question first. And then I'll open up the question to whatever, other people saying it in their own words. There's a Talmudic principle. Patur. In other words, if I get benefit, but my benefit did not cost you any money or any damage, I cannot bill you for my benefit. See what I'm saying? So if I'm doing something, I'm deriving benefit, but I'm not increasing your costs, you cannot bill me, okay? If I derive benefit from you, but it doesn't increase your cost, you can't bill me. So again, that's the principle. When exactly do you apply that in principle is another discussion. But if you apply that principle to this case, then I tell my neighbor, look, my neighbor, you built 4 walls around my property, but you built those 4 walls because you wanted for your property. The fact that I am benefiting from what you did seemingly is of no consequence to you. The fact that I'm getting a benefit, that shouldn't bother you. And therefore, I shouldn't have to pay, even if you surround me from 4 walls. In other words, we have 2 problems. One problem is how do you build a guy if he doesn't consent explicitly? But then there's even a deeper problem, a philosophical problem. What are you building me for? You're building me for because you gave me benefit, but that benefit that you give me did not increase your costs. So you made your house beautiful. The fact that I benefited, now I have a more beautiful view to look out my window. The fact that I'm getting benefits does not cost you anything more than you would have to pay anyway to live in a beautiful house. So therefore, seemingly this is inconsistent with the Talmudic view that in such a case I should not have to pay. Reminds me of a joke. They say a joke. There's this fictional character. His name was Herschela, and he was very poor, very smart. They tell all kinds of jokes about him, cute stories. It's a folklore, Jewish folklore. So once upon a time, Herschel needed a new jacket, but he couldn't afford a jacket. So he saves up money for many months. Then he goes to the tailor and he says, Tailor, I need you to sew a jacket for me. I need you to make a jacket for me, but it's a unique design. He says, what's the design? He says, the front should be silk. That's what just what a Jew wears on Shabbos. He wears silk in the front. But I don't have enough money for a whole garment of silk. So the back, don't make silk, make it sackcloth. Cheap material. The tailor never got an order like that. So he says, fine, okay, this is what you want. This is what I'll do. So the first Shabbos after he gets his new suit, Herschel goes to shul, and he's got this beautiful, gorgeous silk garment in the front, and in the back, it's sackcloth. It looks like he's in mourning or something. So everyone starts looking at him, and someone says to him, Herschel, what's going on? How come you don't have silk in the back of your shirt? What's going on? He says, listen. Herschel says, when I look down, I see the silk. I don't see what goes on in the back. You want me to wear silk in the back so you could see the silk? You pay for it. I'm not paying for it. So the fact that you're wearing a nice suit and I look at it and it looks pleasant, you can't bill me that I now got the benefit of watching your suit, because the fact that I'm getting a benefit, but you're not taking any loss. So why is it that you would have to pay? That's the question that the commentaries are bothered by or troubled by. But I think they're also bothered by the underlying question is, in some sense, how could you make me pay if I did not consent? So this is a problem.
Rabbi, just a side question, make sure that I understand. Privacy is not a question here. It is for security. What kind of benefit? Because of the height of the fence, of the height of the...
No. The privacy is not of a benefit. It's not a discussion because nobody lives here yet. Maybe you live here. I don't live here yet. It's still a ruin. If I would live here, then you at any point can say, look, if I would live here, at any point Vicky shows up and Vicky says, look, Menachem, you are intruding on my land with your sight, even though it's not tangible, but it's an intangible damage, because now I can't relax and eat my dinner in peace, in privacy, eating my dinner outside. And inside, I don't want to live inside because it's 110 degrees outside, because we're living in Babylonia. So if I'm living here at any point, one party could to get the other party to build a wall 4 cubits, no problem. This case is a little bit different because we're not living here. And again, to be honest with you, Maimonides made up this case. In the Talmud, it's not a case of ruined houses, it's a case of fields. And field is a similar case where you're not living there, so you're not intruding on the other person every day, but you have a benefit that your field is enclosed. And everybody enclosed. Everybody wants to know, why is Maimonides talking about a ruin? Is he saying that it's only a ruin? Is the Talmud says field? Is it in addition to the field? So you got many layers of debate of what Maimonides is exactly saying here. But the reason why we're not talking about privacy here is because I don't live here. Either because it's a field, or it's because, so even if a field, I come once a week to my field, okay, but I'm not, there's no expectation of privacy in a field. So therefore, we're not referring to privacy, either because it's a field or because it's a ruin, a house that I don't live in. But what we're talking here is a more broad case. We're neighbors. I invest in my own, or you invest in your own land, and you better that property. Now it's protected. Now at any point, maybe there will be encouragement for me to start using my house and living in my house and fixing up the house because part of the cost was mitigated by you. Now I have, now it's protected. I don't have to pay for the cost of the walls, right? So now what happens is we have neighbors. One person shows up and betters his own land. The neighbor does not benefits. The neighbor benefits. The question is, if my neighbor is benefiting, could I send him a bill as well? So what Maimonides seems to be saying, if you only surrounded your neighbor from 3 walls, so your neighbor didn't really benefit in the main concept. Maybe it's nicer, but he didn't really get the security. So he can argue, I really didn't get any benefit. You can't bill me at all. But if the neighbor then goes, in other words, if the person who did not build the 3 walls builds himself a 4th wall, that's easy to defend. That makes sense. Yeah. If I build my own 4th wall after you build 3 walls, it's clear that I want your 4 walls. And that building of the 4 walls shows the consent. But what the harder case to defend is if I didn't agree, you go ahead and you build 4 walls around my property, which you have the right to, because you have the right to build a wall. You can even build a wall on my land, right? That center, that in-between space is reserved for the wall at some point. If I'm gonna live here, I'm gonna have to build a wall. So you have the right to intrude a foot or 2, whatever the case, a handbreadth or 2, depending on the size of the wall. You have the right to build a wall on my property, on the border of the properties. But if you build the 4th wall, even if I didn't consent, I'm gonna have, you can bill me for all 4 walls. And the question is, how exactly could you bill me for something, for giving me benefit that I did not consent to it? Seemingly that's not consistent with the general rule of the Talmud. So you want the good news or the bad news? The bad news is that I'm not sure I have an excellent answer for this. It's not written explicitly, but the good news is maybe the later commentaries, the contemporary sages are try to address this. And what they say is like this. They say, look, make no mistake, we're not talking about a stranger. A stranger comes and builds a wall. He can't bill me for it. It doesn't work that way. That was the case that Zach was concerned with. On that case that I said, you come to me and you wash my windows without my consent, and you bill me for washing my windows without my consent. I don't agree. I have some freedom to decide how I want to invest and spend my money. So we're not talking about that case. What we're really talking about is specifically a neighbor. And what the Talmud's perspective, even though the Talmud doesn't say so explicitly, what the Talmud seems to be saying, even though it's like I said, it's not stated explicitly, but it seems like this is the perspective of the Talmud, is that neighbors by definition have a similarity to partners. In other words, if I move into town and I move into next door to you, at some point it is the assumption of responsibility there is an assumption of partnership that we together are responsible for this land. In other words, I'm not responsible for your land and you're not responsible for my land, but at least at the border point, at the place where we touch, we're seen more as partners than as strangers, right? How do you view your neighbor? So in America, my neighbor is my stranger. You can live 40 years, you don't even know your neighbor's name, certainly if you live in New York City or in cities. But even in the suburbs, it's possible that I don't know my neighbor. So I view my neighbor. What's a neighbor? Neighbor is a technicality. It happens to be your land borders my land. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean we have some sort of a deeper relationship. But it seems to be saying what this law seems to imply, and the law doesn't make sense otherwise, because if you don't read it this way, then it's inconsistent with the Talmud's principles itself. The law seems to imply that if I'm your neighbor, we are our partners in some degree, and if we are partners, then if we're partners in any venture, then there are certain responsibilities that we both have to pay for. Not everything. You can't force me to do anything if you're a partner. But if we're a partner in a land, there are certain things that we do that each partner can force the other one to participate in if that's the normal custom. For example, let me give you an example. From later, it's going to say that all the people in the city could force each other to pay to protect the city, right? If we have a wall and we have a lock around the city. So we're talking about a walled city. So if you moved into a walled city, you consent that you want the protection of the wall. The problem is the lock broke. So the Mishnah says, if the lock breaks, all the people of the city could force each other to pay to repair the lock. In other words, if you're living in a walled city, you are taking responsibility that you're joining this partnership, and therefore not every cost, but there are going to be certain costs. You can't force me to pay for the holiday decorations or a holiday parade. Maybe in America you could, but not in the Talmud. But a certain basic responsibility to the partnership that I consent to when I decide to move into this walled city. So similarly, if I move into a property, there is going to be it's not a stranger anymore. The stranger relationship is gone. And therefore, of course, my neighbor cannot just benefit the land and start sending me bills. But there is going to be a certain degree of minimal benefit that if the neighbor invests and it benefits me, then in certain cases, I'm going to have to pay, even though if it wasn't my neighbor, I would not have to pay. And the idea here is, how does the Talmud view neighbors? And remember, we're not living in a time today where people move and people come, people go. You could be living in the same shtetl for 1,000 years or 500 years, and your grandmother lived here and your great grandkids are going to live here. We're trying to cultivate some sense of community and some sense of viewing your neighbors not as strangers, but as partners. Now, partners, good neighbors need good walls. And that's exactly what the whole section up till now is, that you have your sense of privacy. They can't walk into your house. They can't do whatever they want. They could force you to build a wall, etc. But in certain cases, if neighbors are partners, then in certain cases, if my partner benefits the venture in certain basic benefits, I would have to pay. So that is that's the way I have seen this piece of Talmud explained to make it consistent with the general rule. The general rule is, if you give me benefit, but it doesn't cost you anything, there's no increased cost to you, I shouldn't have to pay. But in this case, you build your walls around your ruins, and the fact that I get benefit doesn't really cost you more. So why do I have to pay? Because we're partners. That's the only interpretation I have seen. Maybe good, maybe not good, maybe you have better ones, maybe it's not clear, but I'm just putting out there what we have in the Talmud and what I have seen from the commentaries. So that will be it for today. We have one more week before, I believe, if I'm looking at the calendar correctly, before we shift Tuesday mornings and we go to the JLI, which will be talking about life and the journey of the soul, life and the afterlife, what Judaism says about that. So we'll take after next week, we'll take a 6-week break from Maimonides, and then you can be sure that we're coming back to Maimonides with renewed strength and renewed vigor, and I'm looking forward to it. So that's the story in short. Any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.
Well, Rabbi, I just want to thank you for bringing up this commentary, because it kind of redefines a little bit or deepens the understanding of neighbor. So neighbor, even if you don't live that full time, the fact that you share something, it kind of gives you more responsibility, more insight into the neighbor relationships.
Right.
So even for now, I wish more people studied.
Right.
But
Right? So there's a limit. Of course, we're not saying that my neighbor is my partner, so they can go and invest anything they want in their property and come to me and say, oh, I benefited our block. Now the value of the block went up, so now I'm going to bill you. Of course, we're not saying in all cases, but in certain cases, the Talmud would allow for a benefit that my neighbor gave to me. If I received the benefit, in certain cases, they can also send me the bill. Why? If you're a stranger, it wouldn't work. Oh, we're not a stranger. Okay, that's already a philosophical shift. So of course you can't take anything to the extreme. Now I want to say one thing about all these laws. These laws all come from the third tractate in the Talmud called Baba Batra, the third gate. The third gate, most verses in the Talmud are based on verses in the Torah. Okay, the third gate has no verses in the Torah. In other words, this idea of how to live civilly with your friend, the Talmud, the Torah itself does not regulate. Torah says be a mensch, as we'll see later in this section. There's a few verses that say be a mensch. But as opposed to the earlier sections of the earlier tractates that discuss monetary law, if I damage you, the verse says exactly what I'm supposed to do. If you have a lost object, the verse says what I have to do. If I'm your employee, what are your responsibilities to me? The Torah spells that out. But then we have a full section, a full tractate, the longest tractate in the Talmud actually, is how to relate to partners, how to relate to neighbors. There's no verses in the Torah about that directly. So a lot of it is the rabbis trying to think about how do we view the relationship between people. So a lot of what we're saying here is actually rabbinic law. So it's just an interesting shift. It's very different than the other sections of the Talmud, which are really analyzing and applying verses. You're going to see that there are no verses in this tractate. There's one verse which basically says, do me a favor, do good. And we see how the Talmud defines that and how it applies it, but that's for the next, after our 6-week break, because we're not going to be able to get to it next week. But that's just a disclaimer. There are no verses that are saying this. This is the rabbis of the Talmud trying to apply how would it be to live, what society do we want to create? And again, like I said before in the previous introductions, these laws cannot necessarily be carried over exactly to today, because a lot of this is based on local custom and local expectation, and all that changes in the modern world. But hopefully some of those principles, like Vicky says, how do I view my neighbor? Do I view my neighbor as a stranger or as a partnership? We care for this land together. Doesn't mean you can bill me for whatever you want, but at some point, cultivating that perspective may be beneficial to society as a whole.
Rabbi.
Yes, Richard. Yes. Richard and me used to be neighbors, and that's how we started. That was before we even knew each other. We had that first soul connection, because we understood, even though we didn't study the Maimonides yet, but we had this innate feeling that neighbors is more than just technicality, but there must be a connection, some sort of partnership. Am I right, Richard?
Exactly what I was going to say. I don't have to say anything else. No, I'm just kidding. Very, very true, though, Rabbi. Very true what you said.
Thank you.
One question. This goes back to a previous session that you had. If a neighbor, and this is a past event, let's say, that happens sometimes in the past, but nonetheless, a neighbor interfered with your peaceful existence or coexistence, as well as caused physical damage to your property. Now, the event has been passed, it's gone, but you know the reality that he did cause you emotional fatigue, interrupted with your peaceful living, as well as damage your property. So even in the past, is there any recourse, or should you let it go, or
it all depends? If there is a legal damage that could be proven and could be billed for, then in the Talmud, your neighbor being your partner doesn't mean he has the right to harm you. And therefore, if there is damage that the person does, you bill him. There are other forms of damage that are not concrete, so it's harder to bill for. For example, nuisance. The person was making noise at night, or the person was making smoke or smells or odor. So there's all kinds of more damages that are less tangible that I may not be able to bill my neighbor for, but certainly depending on the scenario, I should speak up and I should defend myself, because the neighbor doesn't mean, the fact that he's my partner doesn't give him the right to damage me. We're saying to the contrary, he has to be more concerned for my well-being, not less concerned.
Right. But another factor that I want to interject is that even though an instance or a situation such as I mentioned happened in the past, and if it was the past, could be a day, it could be 20 years. I'm not talking the length of time. Is there a way do you just let it go?
So you're asking a psychological question more than a legal question. In a scenario where I cannot claim damages, there's nothing I can do now. The question is, how do I best move forward if I've been harmed by a neighbor, and what should my relationship with that neighbor be? So that's more of a psychological question. And the short answer is it depends. In other words, you have to really ask yourself, where will I be better? Will I be better off forgetting about the pain? Would I be better off dealing with the pain? Would I be better off embracing the pain? Would I be better off learning from the experience? It all depends on the person and how deep the trauma was and what the best way to heal is. And there are different forms of healing. Sometimes healing is ignoring, sometimes healing is going back and reliving. So that is probably an individualistic question. I don't know if there's one general question for that.
Would that come under the umbrella of Kabbalah, speaking from a Kabbalah point of view?
To go under the question of forgiveness. What is teshuvah? What is repentance? What is forgiveness? How do I forgive? When to forgive? We discussed forgiveness in the past. What is forgive? How to forgive? When is forgiveness healthy? Did the person apologize? The person didn't apologize? Sometimes the best thing is to make a wall. If this guy's my neighbor and that person did not respect the boundaries, so you build a wall. A big wall is you separate yourself mentally from that person.
Right.
Physically, certainly physically, you protect yourself physically, but sometimes I have to build a wall mentally. That's part of building walls. And building walls is not only, sometimes we say that building walls is actually, it's not a question of because I don't like you. To the contrary, if I respect you, if you're my neighbor and I respect you, I have to respect your boundaries. So boundaries is actually a sign of respect. So sometimes if the person did not earn that, is abusing this relationship, then the wall should be not just a regular wall, it should be a wall 10 feet high. In other words, higher than the required obligation.
I see. Well, I have to mention one thing. You were a great neighbor.
Thank you.
You were a great neighbor.
You're talking about me. Oh, now I'm going to change my answer. I thought you were talking about me. Okay.
No, you were an exceptionally great. In fact, that's how you know as well. You know, so that's how I ended.